So, hi everybody, this is HETEC Word, our English language broadcast for our viewers. And today we have a special guest with us, Dr. Michael Brown, radio host, author from the United States. Good morning, Dr. Brown.
Good to be with you. Good morning, sir.
It's a very, very exciting and interesting time. We have only a little bit more than 3 weeks until the US presidential elections. We are going to talk about that, but I would like to first ask you that we have saw on the news two devastating hurricanes struck the US. How can the nation cope with that, and how does it influence the whole election season?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, we have to cope with it, but there's a tremendous amount of suffering. Florida got hit consecutively by two massive hurricanes. Millions of people without power and a number of people killed, and it's going to take a long time to rebuild. But the shocker was in North Carolina, about 2 hours from where I live, 2, 3 hours in different directions. There are mountain communities, and no one ever thought of a hurricane doing massive damage there. They're inland, but there had been heavy rain, and then when Hurricane Helene hit, so a couple of weeks back, when that hit, uh, the river rose and it's completely wiped out whole towns. I mean, there you see where they were, and they're gone. And people living in isolated areas, you have these hundreds of mountain roads. You just can't get to them. The roads are washed away. So my wife has been going up regularly, helping with these relief efforts, and she's telling me it's extraordinary. It would take years and years to rebuild, and so much of the river just washed up. So all these rocks have washed up, and then the river filled with houses ripped apart and trailers, just trucks just riding pull down the river, and they'll probably in the end going to be hundreds of people who are killed. So it's unprecedented. It's kind of unimaginable. As far as impacting the elections, Florida is a very strong red state, and there's nothing that would happen here that I can tell that would turn voters away from voting Republican. North Carolina is a swing state. It leans Republican overall in terms of what's expected, but there's a lot of people are disgruntled with the way the government has handled this. They feel that government agencies have really not been there. It's mainly Christian groups coming to help and rebuild. So perhaps, just possibly, it might bring more negative sentiment towards the Democrats. But I'm just speculating on that. I haven't seen anything decisive in terms of a polling analysis.
And how does it affect the mood of the people? It's a fearsome natural disasters, and it seems that it's getting more and more frequent. Do people uh, are people more pessimistic about the future? What is the feeling about how do the Americans feel now?
Yeah, well, everything is swirling now. And America's a big country, 330 million people and 3,000 miles across. So there's so many different things going on. Some feel that the hurricanes can be a distraction from Kamala Harris because many Americans still don't know who she is and what she stands for. And she's trying to hide who she really is and what she really stands for, trying to pose herself as more in the center and not as radical left as she is. So some think that all the attention on the hurricanes will distract from her being able to get her message out. That's one theory that's out there. Uh, for sure, those that believe in climate change are saying that this is now the direct result of climate change. President Biden has basically said, if you don't recognize this is the result of climate change, then you're blind to not see it. And then with all the conspiracy theories, now there are these crazy things circulating that the government was actually behind this because there are lithium mines in North Carolina, and somehow they were seeding the clouds or doing whatever. It's almost like bringing out the worst in everything and in everybody, along with the best in terms of those that are helping and serving. But it does add to a negative feeling. It does add to a feeling of things being out of control. And you have to realize it's been a time of tremendous upheaval in America. First, the massive resistance to the Trump presidency, the lawsuits, what's going to happen next, lawsuits against President Biden's own son. Then you have Biden is out, Harris is in, then an assassination attempt on Trump, then another, and another, and what's going to happen next? Now the hurricanes, and there's that real feeling of everything is unsettled. Of course, this is a tremendous time for prayer and for the gospel because people are much more ready to look to the Lord when they realize how uncertain this world is. And in fact, it's always uncertain. Sometimes we just have a false feeling of stability. On the other hand, I could add this that many young Americans are reluctant to have children because they're afraid that the end of the world is coming because of climate change. So there's a lot more talk about that and a lot more pessimism in the air in general, which again is a great opportunity for the gospel. Conservative Christians are having more kids than secular Americans and atheists on average by a pretty good amount.
It's very interesting that you just recently mentioned that, if I understand correctly, these are not the Christian young people who are now afraid about the end of the world or a major crisis. Earlier in previous decades, it was much more the Christians were regarded. They were told that they are these apocalyptic-minded people. Now,
I would say, of course, with the war in Israel, that brings more feeling of instability. Russia and Ukraine, is that going to erupt into a world war? Is the war in Israel going to erupt into a world war? So that's out there too. And there are plenty of Christians who think this is the end of the world and everything's coming down. But there's a difference between the Christian attitude about the end of the world and the secular attitude about the end of the world. Because even though the Christian attitude about the end of the world, those that are really caught up with prophecy and things, there can be pessimism in terms of everything's getting worse, but that means Jesus is getting closer. That's how they look at it. Whereas the secular world, they don't have that hope. And they just think everything is unraveling. And then interestingly, although American politics are tremendously divisive, more than in many countries, and we just have the two main parties, and any smaller ones are really fringe, they don't really have an impact. So you really have the two main parties, and the divisions seem to grow greater with each election. In each election, we're told this is the most important election in American history. And then we're now being told that if Trump wins, it's over for democracy. He's going to take over and impose his will. And then the other side says, no, if Harris wins, that's the end of democracy because the Democrats are going to take over and impose their will. So things are really volatile. Things are really on edge in a way that I haven't seen on this level in quite some time in America.
if this election is so important, so crucially important as we understand, how can it be that I've just read in a recent poll research that nearly half of the evangelical Christians told that they are not going to vote in the November presidential elections.
So I don't know if the numbers are that high. I mean, when you do research, you find that almost every group does not nearly vote as much as it could. So it's not just evangelical Christians that don't vote as much as we could. High percentages of Americans don't vote as much as we could. But to the extent it is true, there are several factors. One is the idea that politics is worldly. Politics is unclean. It's the system of this world. We're not of this world. So kind of maybe a pietism that maybe a certain spirituality that says that we don't touch these unclean things, or why bother? The whole system has fallen. Both parties are corrupt. So a certain skepticism. Another reason is that many of us wanted a different candidate than Trump this time around. He has so much baggage. He's now really softened his pro-life views. They've changed the Republican platform. They removed opposition to same-sex marriage. So many are just not enthusiastic. Many Americans are not enthusiastic with either candidate. High polling indicated some months ago that both sides wanted different candidates than Biden and Trump, and now it's Harris and Trump. So that's another reason, uh, the just not being that enthusiastic about Trump. And a third one is maybe just indifference. You know, you kind of worn out the endless rhetoric. Everyone's saying this is the most important election, this is the most important election, this is the most important election, and people just kind of lose interest. That being said, I'm 100% sure that the outcome of the election is completely secondary to the state of the church, meaning that if the church in America came alive and experienced real revival, that would influence the nation far more than the election outcomes, because that's the flip side, that many Christians put far more emphasis in the outcome of the elections than in the state of the church. That we get into this frenzy now for at least a year leading up to the elections. It's like always election season and 24/7 news, always talking about it. That it's just constant. And all the end, we've got to get this candidate in, we've got to get this one. Okay, now the next election, we have to. The elections are important, but they're far less important than the church experiencing awakening. And to me, we need to put our greater emphasis there and then encourage people to vote. Tell everyone to vote, but put our big emphasis not on the elections, but on the state of the church.
This is the third election that Christians have to make their decision about Trump, Donald Trump. 8 years ago, it seemed that it was like a natural, practical connection. Trump offered that he would be the voice for the Christians. He would make promises for pro-life Supreme Court judges and promises about Israel. Then 4 years ago, and he more or less promised, more or less fulfilled his promises. Am I right? Did he fulfill in his first
Yes.
term his promises?
Yeah, he it surprised me. Originally, I completely opposed him. Then, when it was him versus Hillary Clinton, I decided to vote for him, hopeful, but with a lot of concern. And certainly, he did things that were alienating, and not just the bad tweets, but a lot of what he did sowed a lot of division, deepened the division in America, and hurt our witness in many ways because some of the evangelical leaders identified with Trump, that it became Trump and Jesus. That's what we were associated with. It made our witness look bad. Nonetheless, overall, he absolutely kept his biggest promises. And come 2020, I voted for him with less hesitation than I did in 2016. At the same time, I became increasingly concerned at the state of the church. Rather than us changing him, he was changing us. And I became increasingly concerned when all these prophets were guaranteeing 4 more years and 8 straight years in the White House, and Biden will never sit in the White House. And some colleagues and I knew that if Trump is not elected, it's going to be a terrible scandal, which it was. And I wrote much about it when I was interviewed by the New York Times. I said it was the biggest deception I'd ever seen in all my years in the Lord, on a massive scale. So much and worst of all, most never repented, most never acknowledged their error. They twisted, they changed the story. They said he really is the president spiritually, all kinds of excuses. Now, 4 years later, I don't hear the prophets prophesying. That's a positive. At least people have gone a little more quiet. And there's not as much enthusiasm for Trump across the board on conservative Christian side, because he softened his views on abortion and disappointed in some other ways, and continues to, just insult and attack in ways that are unnecessary. But there has been a stronger rise of, you could say, Christian nationalist support for Trump. People really associating him with American freedom. That part has remained strong, and that's been like a big issue. Are Christians trying to take over? And when in America, the critics want to point to a nation that is run by kind of a Christian tyrant, they point to Viktor Orban and Hungary. They say that these people want to make America like Hungary. And of course, many of us say, hey, Hungary's doing a great job. But in America, that's like for the critics, for those on the left, that's an example of what America should not be. It's just interesting from our perspective how Hungary and Viktor Orban are looked at through different eyes.
Yeah, it would be very interesting to talk about that. I would be happy to share our views because I know that the Hungarian Prime Minister is regarded as sort of an icon in many circles, but he's in a very difficult position now. Just 2 days ago, he was debating in Strasbourg at the European Parliament, and he was attacked from so many sides. So he is in a very difficult position because it seems that the whole Europe is just uniting behind his uh, his uh, his challenger. He has now quite a strong challenger domestically, and it will be a much more difficult time for him in the next elections to defend his position. So he needs to be. I don't think he's a tyrant, uh, but uh, but he's defending Hungary as much as he can against migration and the family values. But he's not regarded as a Christian politician figure.
It depends on, just like everything else, those who like him think he's a great example, and those who don't think he's a Christian tyrant.
Yeah.
So it's just like in America, the term Christian nationalism has become very big. So when Christian nationalism is being talked about every day, it has been for many months. The question is, what does it mean? Does it mean you love Jesus and you love your country? Does it mean you think your country was founded on Christian values and those values are best? Does it mean you want to take over the government and force Christian values on everyone? Does it mean you want to take over the government violently? What does it actually mean? So everyone throws it around and it becomes this scare tactic. So we're having to really process a lot of that as well. That's kind of a sub debate under the elections. And then Trump has really distanced himself from anything that would sound like that. And because he's not deeply pro-life to the core convictionally, he's just trying to get votes certain ways. And then the left is saying, no, he's part of a Christian takeover and they're going to take away your rights and destroy the government. And then others on the right are saying, no, look at what the Democrats, they're trying to silence us. They're trying to take away our freedom of speech. And I understand the concerns on both sides. You've got extreme voices on each side. So in fact, for the most part, if you'll see the ads or listen to highlights from like the presidential debate, each side is attacking the other side for positions it doesn't even hold. Each side is campaigning based on extreme caricatures of the other side. And that's what makes things all the more volatile. And then most Americans listen to one type of news. They get just sources from one side only. So it's reinforced. It's like they're in their own echo chamber, and everything is just reinforced over and over again. So the divisions are deepening. And what I try to encourage is have conversations with people you differ with, especially Christians. Find out what they actually believe and then hear them out and then have a constructive conversation. We don't do a lot of that in America, but we have to.
That's very interesting. Now, it seems that, as you mentioned, President Trump also distanced himself from the uh, Christian world. As far as I can see, he's not visited the church in this election campaign. Am I right?
I'm really not sure, but that didn't necessarily impress Americans that much, that he would show up at a church service. It was more that he had strong evangelical support from key leaders, and he still does in many ways. At the Republican National Convention, Franklin Graham was there and prayed, and Trump is our best man to do it. So maybe there's less talk about him being a Christian. maybe he's not referencing, like holding up a Bible as if he was Christian. Maybe there's less of that outward appearance, uh, which is, just more realistic, I would say, because there's no evidence that he's been born again or really knows the Lord. Um, and I don't know that evangelicals have the same level of access that they did during his presidency. One colleague of mine that was very close to him leading up to the election and through his presidency has not really had access to him more recently. So, I can't really speak to that. But for sure, there's less of a there's less of a feel that he's the savior than there was 4 years ago. And that's one of the things that I fought against the whole time. There are no political saviors. So on the one hand, it's positive that we're not over exalting Trump, although surviving the assassination attempt, the way that happened, that really lifted him up in the eyes of many, his courage and things like that. But I think that there's a more realistic assessment of his strengths and weaknesses and not as much talk about him being a Christian or something like that, or even a baby Christian. There's a deep feeling, though, that the Democrat agenda has gotten so radical and so far to the left that we've got to get Trump in to stop that from taking place. That's one thing. And then the other thing is that when it comes to international affairs, we feel much better with him when it comes to Israel being able to fight its battles. When it comes to him as a savior, we still think, hey, he's going to do a much better job on this. The Democrats are just really weak on all these fronts.
So, Dr. Brown, thank you very much for your insights. It's been very useful. It drew us closer to this election campaign and to the mood in America. We are praying with our viewers, are praying for America for this season because it is also important for the world and for Europe as well. So maybe we can continue this discussion
Yes.
next time. So thank you very much for your visit.
Yes, thank you. And just pray for God's best, God's will.